name is Jen. I am a cognitive scientist and a data scientist. And in my day-to-day life, I tend to wear my data science hat most often, but I'm really excited tonight because I'm going to get to put my cognitive science hat on. So that's definitely something that I am grateful for. I understand from Luke that you have already had one talk on sort of the mechanics or inner workings of large language models like ChatGPT. So I'm not going to focus on the technical side of things this evening. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about more of the sort of potential social implications of this technology, and also just talk a little bit about sort of this from a cognitive science lens and why I think that this technology might have some of the impacts that it's going to have. So the first thing I get to do tonight is talk to you about my favorite cognitive scientist, a cognitive scientist by the name of Daniel Dennett. And he's certainly one of the most famous, well-known cognitive scientists and philosophy of mind people. And he, in the 1980s, 1987, wrote a book called The Intentional Stance. And what's fun about being in cognitive science right now is that people came up with a lot of theories in the mid 1900s onwards, but it really wasn't until relatively recently that technology started to catch up, and we started to see the relevance of some of these theories. And so, in a nutshell, Dennett's theory, which he called the intentional stance, and I'm going to paraphrase this now, so hopefully none of you are Dennett scholars, but I think this is fairly accurate to Dennett. He said that in a nutshell, as humans, under the right circumstances, and I will get to those in just a minute, under the right circumstances, it's easier for us. And indeed, we may be evolutionarily hardwired to treat an object as if it were a person and not an object. And basically what he meant by that is that under the right circumstances, we will assume that that object has some kind of an inner life, desires, intentions, that kind of thing. Now, what are those circumstances under which we might do that? Well, one of the answers is that if something can use language convincingly, it's certainly going to be a tipping point for us to view that object as an intelligent agent. And in fact, it's probably not even a requirement for us to reach this tipping point of what Dennett called the intentional stance that an object use language. I mean, we're very prone as humans to attributing thoughts, beliefs, and desires to other objects. For example, you've probably had an experience where you're driving your car down the street, or you're going up a hill, and you might start talking to your car, and you might say, come on, Bessie, you can do it. You can make it up the hill. I know you don't want to, but let's go. And so there, obviously, if somebody asked you, you wouldn't say, oh, my car is thinking about doing this. But somehow we fall into this very naturally. And particularly where language is concerned, this is really viewed as key. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why, for example, language was viewed as so central to the Turing test, which was a test that was devised by Turing. He actually called it the imitation game. And he said that one of the ways we could determine if we had reached the point of artificial intelligence is if we could have a conversation with that intelligence where we could not tell if it really was a person or an artificial intelligence. And a defining feature of that was being able to have a conversation with that agent. Another example that some of you might be familiar with here, if you have seen the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, I think this is a fantastic example of this, because in that movie, there is an artificial intelligence named HAL, and Kubrick didn't go to a lot of lengths to create some very realistic looking artificial intelligent agent in the movie. He just had this sort of flashing red light. But it was an extremely convincing depiction because of the fact that Hal had this very compelling, almost hypnotic voice that Hal used to talk to the other characters in the story. And that in and of itself was enough to convince us, the viewers, that Hal had some kind of potentially devious intelligence going on behind the red flashing light. We are starting to see this, although that was an example from science fiction, we are starting to see some of this playing out in real life. So I have a question, and I will have to see how the logistics of this works in this hybrid context, but I think I can see people. And I was wondering if I could get a show of hands who has come across Blake Lemoine, who was a Google engineer working in their responsible AI department. I see some people raising their hands. I'm paging through the videos, so definitely a few people. And if there's anybody in the chat who has, or sorry, in online who has heard this, you can give me an emoji thumbs up there. But this made news, not that long ago, last year, basically. And Lemoine was an engineer who was working with this large language model. And he reached a point where he really believed that the large language model was intelligent, had sentience, was conscious, and in fact went so far as to, for example, hire a lawyer to try to protect the rights of the large language model, LaMDA. And so you can see in that case that we're sort of moving out of this realm of science fiction and into a space where, if you buy my argument, perhaps due to our propensity for the intentional stance, it's almost impossible for us not to attribute basically intelligence and sentience to objects when they start exhibiting these behaviors. And I would encourage you, I'm going to see if I can, it's on my slide here, and I'm going to see if I can get it into the chat here. Now, I know for those of you who are there in person, you're not going to be able to follow this link immediately, but it's in my slide deck. All my links are in my slides as well. But basically, if you follow this link, you will be taken to his Medium article where he shows a transcript of a conversation he had with LaMDA. And I think by reading that transcript, you can start to realize sort of how compelling some of these behaviors really are. What implications does this have? Well, on the technical front, while it's true that large language models, which is to say machine learning models that are basically neural nets with large numbers of parameters that have been trained to convincingly produce natural language when prompted to do so. So these large language models, it's true that they do, to get them off the ground, need a large amount of data. And also it's true that to get them trained, it does take it's a heavy lift in terms of the processor capabilities required. And so I was reading one estimate that said that they believed that it took, I think, $1.7 million worth of processor time to train up one of these large language models. So it's true that it's not a piece of cake to get them off the ground. But the reality is that with the existence of the internet, we do have the large data sets. With distributed computing, we do have the processor power we need. And the reality is that once they have actually been created, they aren't that difficult to deploy. And once they've been created, they don't require a huge amount of memory capacity to deploy either. And so it's not far-fetched to think that suddenly a lot of our technology is potentially going to have this type of ability added into the technology. And so again, this is my night when I get to reference a lot of my favorite science fiction stories. So this is a reference in this slide to Douglas Adams, where he talked about genuine people personalities. So you can imagine your thermostat being imbued with the ability to have a conversation with you. A lot of you folks were talking about the weather earlier. So you can imagine that your thermostat, when you wake up in the morning, might start saying, you know, hey, Jen, how's it going? Are you looking forward to getting outside today? It's a nice temperature inside the house, but it's not looking so great outside the house. You might want to put on a coat. And if you imagine your thermostat doing this, your toaster doing this, your fridge doing this, if you're an introvert, suddenly you might be inundated by not just people talking to you all the time, but potentially all of your appliances talking to you all the time as well. So this is going to have some impacts on our experiences. And so there's sort of this question, how do we orient ourselves to this new reality? And so to help us think about that question, I'm going to show you this. You may have seen this in other contexts because it's a picture, it's sort of an abstracted graph that's often used when people are talking about new technologies. And sometimes they'll talk about these technologies in terms of there being this potential for exponential growth with the new technology. And by exponential growth, I just mean often, you know, we think about things as increasing in a very predictable stepwise fashion. That's that sort of linear growth pattern. But it's possible that if we think about an exponential curve, it starts out very slowly. It seems like it's moving slowly, but then all of a sudden it takes off very quickly, more quickly than we tend to anticipate. And I have to tell you that I have been skeptical often when people talk about technology in these terms, having lived through a number of what they refer to as the AI winters, where the promise of AI did not live up to expectations. But I will say that in this particular moment, and for some of the reasons that I've just mentioned, relating to cognitive science theories like the intentional stance, and also the fact that language has for a long time, as we've seen by how Turing phrased the Turing test, been somewhat of a holy grail of artificial intelligence. I'm starting to think that it is possible in this case that we may just be at one of these tipping points where things take off in unpredictable and surprising directions, and they do it in a manner that's very rapid. So let's suppose for a minute that this might be the case. The question then is, how do we successfully surf this wave as it's rising in front of us? Well, one of my arguments here, and this is something that my colleague John and I are often talking to people about when we're trying to help them implement these technologies. And I should say that often we are working with people who do not have a technical background, and so we need to talk to them in terms that are familiar to them. In these situations, our belief is that it actually makes more sense to lean into the intentional stance rather than shying away from it. And so when I say this, you know, I've been having a lot of conversations with people about ChatGPT. And one of the things I quickly hear from the tech community is that the abilities of ChatGPT and other large language models are overblown. And in a sense, the abilities of these technologies are illusionary. And I'm sympathetic to that as someone who has a decent understanding of what is going on beneath the hood. But at the same time, I think that from a social perspective, it makes sense for us to rather lean into the fact that we will be interacting with and thinking about these technologies in a way that's categorically different, I would argue, than the way we deal with things like hammers and egg beaters, shall we say. So my suggestion in these cases is, first of all, we do need to start looking beyond thinking about these technologies as just a brain in a vat, which is to say we need to look beyond thinking about them as just the algorithm itself. Or what I sometimes refer to when I'm talking to people without a technical background as the AI engine. So it's true that the AI engine is very important. Obviously, if you don't have an engine, your car isn't going to go anywhere. But the reality is that when most people use cars, they aren't thinking about the engine. They don't know how the engine works. All they really care about is what the engine is going to do for them. So step one is, yeah, exactly, not Futurama. Don't think about these technologies like a brain in a vat. So what is the alternative to that? And again, this is where I'm saying we may have to lean into this a bit, even though as technologically savvy people, we understand that it's not exactly what's going on under the hood. Practically speaking, it may make sense in terms of us adapting to these technologies to really start treating and working with AI more as a coworker than as a tool. And I say that in terms of how we are going to integrate these technologies into our lives. Because if suddenly you have one of these technologies in your workplace and you just treat it as a tool, or if you're a manager and you're going to bring this technology into your workspace and think of it as a tool, it's probably not going to work as well in terms of how you integrate it into how your team works, for example, as if you were to think of it more as a digital worker who is coming in to work alongside the other members of your team. We also have to think about this more broadly, because the reality is that for people who maybe will be growing up with these technologies, they will probably be developing, potentially again, because of their predisposition towards the intentional stance, they might start developing relationships with these technologies. Again, because that language factor is so powerful in terms of how we think of these technologies as operating behind the scenes. And the third part of this, I would say, is to recognize within this context, if we agree that we don't want to think about these technologies merely as a tool, an engine, or a brain in the vat, and we are going to have to start thinking about how to interact with them as a digital worker, we have to recognize that the interface plays a tremendously important role in this broader context. So we have to think about how can we make these technologies work so that they interact with us in a way that allows us to interact with them as if they're not just a brain in the vat. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why I'm very excited about these large language models, not just for their capabilities in and of themselves, and not just for the fact that, for example, they can, create a grant proposal. I'm not advocating doing this, but at least hypothetically speaking, they could create a grant proposal or a draft of a grant proposal very quickly. I'm more interested in them because I believe that they will represent the ability for us to create good interfaces to other intelligent technologies. So for example, AI engines that currently exist behind the scenes and that are really hard for people to interact with, if we can put one of these language models at the front of those engines, then that's going to give us an interface and other people an interface to use them in a way that's more beneficial and useful. So that's sort of the general argument. But I think now we can ask, what will the societal impacts of these technologies be more broadly? And this is where I would hope, in fact, I understand that there's a discussion portion of the evening. So this is where I'm going to be really interested to hear more of your thoughts on what you think the impacts will be. But to get things started, I will give a few of my thoughts on sort of how these technologies might impact things. I'm going to be a little bit in the weeds here, and hopefully this will spark some thoughts more generally about the impacts of these technologies. So where are we now? What are we starting to have over the last year, over the last several months? Well, the first big thing we're, I think, going to see is high levels of process automation. And often when we talk about process automation, maybe some of you have encountered, for example, robotic process automation or RPA. But process automation is potentially going to extend beyond sort of rote mechanical tasks and move into space where we're automating processes that involve, generating emails, responding to requests. And that's going to have a massive impact on how we work in our workspace. I was just mentioning, thinking about it in terms of the teams you work with. So what is going to happen when you have new team members that are digital and that are going to come in and do something that previously you or your coworkers were doing? Likely, one of the things that's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of people who have to sort of consider what their job is and consider, what am I really going to do now? And again, these are things which, maybe a year or two ago or 3 years ago, we thought, oh, that's coming soon, but it's not anytime on the, near horizon. Whereas I would say within the last few months, we're starting to think, well, maybe this is where we're arriving at now. As I say, another thing we are starting to have through these large language models is a viable AI interface for these other technologies that I've mentioned. And with the combination of process automation and this as a viable interface for other AI technologies, we really are going to see, I think, some societal impacts in terms of scaling via 24/7 available digital workers. And so those are some sort of potential factors that are, I think, going to impact things quite heavily in terms of how we proceed in our lives, our work lives and our personal lives as well. Another exciting thing that I am really intrigued by and keeping an eye on that we are starting to see is something that's being referred to as emergent abilities in these large language models. And so what this means is basically that these large language models, we've programmed them to sort of statistically predict useful sequences of language such that they can, I would say, mimic conversations. But at this point, we are starting to see them have capabilities that we weren't necessarily anticipating when we set out to program them in that fashion. And so again, I would direct you to, if you're curious to see what some really interesting examples of that, I would direct you to the link at the bottom of the slide here. And again, I've put it in the chat, but I'm hoping that you will have access to these slides post the presentation, and then you'll be able to access that link as well. That's an excellent article. Highly recommend that you take a look at it if you're intrigued by some of the things I'm saying here. I think it's also important to recognize what we don't have yet. I don't think I'd be doing a good job if I didn't bring some skepticism to the talk. So one of the things we don't have, I believe, is human-like intelligence. And the emphasis there is human-like intelligence, because, for example, we know that humans do not learn language. At least individual humans don't learn language in the same way that these models are learning language. So we can't really say that we have cracked the code of intelligence more generally and have a broader understanding of it because of what these models are doing. It could be a step in the right direction, but we're certainly not there yet. And another thing related to that we don't really have are what I would call, artificial general intelligence, or behind the scenes, good general decision-making engines. So while these large language models can convincingly talk a lot, I would not trust them to make decisions on my behalf. That's something that I think we're still working on in the AI space. We also don't fully understand, as I sort of alluded to when I said we don't have human-like intelligence, we don't really understand why these large language models are able to do what they're doing. They are not explainable in a lot of ways. And so at this point, we're still in sort of the tinkering stage, I would argue, with deep learning models in general. And so there's a lot that we can do in that space. And then not surprisingly, because we don't have all of those things I mentioned, we don't really have intelligent robots, situated cognition agents that can operate in real time. And again, that might seem very science fiction for me to be even talking about that. but certainly that indicates that we're not quite there yet when it comes to artificial general intelligence, despite some of the claims and the startling abilities that some of these models are showing. And last but not least, one of the things that we definitely don't have is a lot of regulation of these technologies. And so that is something I suspect may be coming down the pipe sometime soon. Right now, there's a really interesting space in terms of who controls these models, who has access to them. It's moving a lot of different directions. So I think that that's something that's probably on the horizon as well. I will circle a couple of things just before I conclude my talk. And that is that I would say the fact that we are going to probably see increasing levels of process automation in the absence of what I would argue are good general decision-making engines. I do see that as a potential space for some concern and some issues. So I would flag that as something to keep an eye on as well. But other than that, I do think it is a very interesting and exciting time to be in this field. And I hope that the things I've brought up in my talk here have got your wheels turning as well. And I would look forward to turning it over to any questions or comments you might have at this point.